You'll hear a lot of times that data centers will use a ton of water. Well, it depends on the cooling system. And so what you're finding is more and more hyperscalers and neoclouds are going to a closed loop, air-chilled system, which just doesn't use a whole lot of water. The argument now that, hey, this is going to use all the water really isn't an argument anymore.
Joining us today are Jay Reinke, Vice President of Real Estate and Acquisitions, Peter Mahony, Vice President of Investments, and David Amanero, Director of Real Estate and Acquisitions, all from AGP, here to talk about how land, power, and AI demand are colliding, and what it really takes to find and develop data center sites in today's market.
Power is becoming a bit of the lifeblood of the tech world now. The question is no longer, what is the cost of power and can we afford that, but how soon can we get power?
There really isn't an adoption issue anymore. We're seeing that as the models get released, they're permeating into the broader economy. People are using them every day. The constraint for these businesses is no longer adoption of their business model. It's, do we have the compute to satisfy the demand that is already being formed as we speak?
What are the big trends that you're seeing across the data center market? What do you expect to happen here in the next year within this space?
That's a good question. I think
Paul Koetke is the founder of Koetke Consulting. He helps data center companies build the operational infrastructure to meet exponentially growing capacity demands.
Welcome to the Built to Scale podcast, where I interview leaders across the data center industry. My name is Paul Koetke, and I am joined today by three leaders in the data center space at AGP. We've got Jay, Peter, and David, all with various backgrounds who have joined forces to deliver new site locations at AGP. Jay spent 2 decades in corporate real estate, previously at AWS for 5 years, driving data center expansion. He helped acquire 3,100 acres of self-built projects and negotiated 17 billion build-to-suit projects, along with another 1.2 billion of co-location agreements. He is currently the VP of Real Estate and Acquisitions at AGP. Next up, we have Peter Mahony, who prior to AGP was at Jefferies, a boutique investment bank covering power and infrastructure. He got to see firsthand the impact that data center load growth was having on power markets and pricing. And he is currently the VP of Investments at AGP. And lastly, we have David Amanero, who also coming from the Amazon side of the house, was starting in real estate finance, moved across over to co-location business development, and lastly, real estate development at Amazon, and is now the Director of Real Estate and Acquisitions at AGP. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks, Paul.
So, Peter, I'm going to start off with a question for you here. AGP has a strong track record in the renewable energy and real estate development space, and has more recently jumped into the data center space. How did that pivot happen?
Sure. Thanks for having us. AGP was founded in 2018, and it was founded by several partners out of Asia Pacific region. Those partners have been working together for greater than 20 years, and they had really started in the real estate and power development businesses at previous ventures. Starting in 2018, they had recently exited their previous businesses and joined forces to come together and create AGP. But really from that day one experience, they already had the deep bench of experience developing projects from early ideation all the way through to completion. So coming from a background of both real estate and power, when you see the data center trends start to pick up in 2020, 2021, it was a natural avenue to branch out and continue to develop into the data center space. And so that's really how AGP got its start. And moving forward, the data center angle is an increasingly important part of our business, both in Asia Pacific, but now increasingly in the US as well.
That makes a lot of sense. Data centers are really that intersection point between the land and power. And if you're already in a business doing both of those, it's a pretty natural fit to make that next step into the data center space.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I think when you work in both of those spaces and you have not only the contractor relationships, but the power and regulatory relationships in the various jurisdictions and the experience navigating the permitting routes, it's a natural fit for you to be a data center developer and probably a easier jump from different developers that are coming only from a real estate perspective.
Given the background that AGP had in its areas of expertise on the power and real estate side, what is the big step to get into the data center space that was really able to help facilitate that pivot?
Good question. I think the difference between the power relationship between being a generator and being a consumer of power, that's a different commercial relationship with the grid. Ultimately, you're interfacing with similar parties, but it's a different commercial relationship. And also, the data center space is very large projects, as you can imagine. When you're talking about hundreds of megawatts, particularly for these AI data centers, it's a different financing landscape than potentially the legacy renewables businesses were operating under. So it's a new skill set, but it's a lot of the existing experience that was already within the team. It is definitely transferable, but it's a new muscle that we have to build up. And ultimately, having that first avenue with the power and the real estate gave you the leverage to go build that data center franchise.
And so speaking of that team collaboration, how you're working, Jay, walk me through how the two of you collaborate on a deal. What does the power availability and the search for land, how do those interact together, and when do you make that handoff happen?
Paul, great question. 6 years ago at Amazon, we would just tell a company, we would go find a site that made sense to us, and we'd tell the power team, just go get power. And then you saw that probably about 4 years ago, where in Northern Virginia, power started getting constrained. That came in the same wave as AI started kind of coming onto the market. And the AI would just use up just a ton of power. And so now the issue is not just finding land, but it's finding land with available power. And so there really isn't a handoff where ourselves and the power teams working hand in hand throughout the whole process. So if land becomes valuable from data center perspective, if it's got available power with a ramp that makes sense, we say a ramp, how much power is coming year over year into a site. And so there is never a time that myself and both Peter and then some of the other folks on the power team are not working together on a day-to-day basis.
And power is becoming a bit of the lifeblood of the tech world now, because everything's running on AI, or a lot more is running on AI, and all of that needs significant amounts of power to run. Peter, earlier you had mentioned that we're starting to see a little bit of a shift here, and we are seeing that the question is no longer being a question of what is the cost of power and can we afford that, but how soon can we get power? What is the fastest way? Could you elaborate on that some more?
Yeah, I think naturally the cost of power is still very important, given the quantums we're talking about here. But yeah, you're right. The time to power and the ultimate ramp that Jay mentioned is increasingly important. And it's the differentiator between a project that is going to get a lot of attention versus a project that might be less attractive from our perspective, or ultimately the end user perspective. And really it comes down to the end users and what they can do with that power. And really in the last year and a half, we've seen the maturation of the application level of the AI ecosystem. And that's, you think, OpenAI, Anthropic, all the other names. There really isn't an adoption issue anymore. We're seeing that increasingly as the models get released, they're permeating into the broader economy. People are using them every day. It's becoming key parts of our day-to-day workflow. And that's showing up in the revenue of these businesses. If you're reading the Wall Street Journal, it seems like every week there's a new headline of OpenAI or Anthropic just outdid each other on whose revenue and run rate numbers are higher. And so really the impact there is the constraint for these businesses is no longer adoption of their business model. It's no longer, or will we generate revenue? It's, do we have the compute to satisfy the demand that is already being formed as we speak? And so to the extent they can get additional power and additional compute capacity, they can leverage that to utilize the power, but also convert it into revenue. And so having that power ramp show up as quickly as possible and ramp as high as possible is increasingly important.
And Jay, as you're looking at these sites and you're evaluating power on these, are you finding more of a mentality of, if we can't buy it, build it, and putting behind the meter power on site to disconnect from the grid and have your own personal source of power for that data center?
Yes, in select markets. So typically to do that, it needs to be a deregulated electricity market. So you're going to see Texas, we're going to probably be, is already becoming a hot market, and it'll probably surpass Virginia, they say by 2030, as far as the number of data centers, the number of megawatts produced or used. And the reason is Texas is purely deregulated. So if you have land with gas line availability or gas available close by, and you have the ability to go get recips or CTs or CCGTs, anything to produce electricity, then you're finding folks who are going out and kind of assembling land with availability to go build their own power, what they call behind the meter. There are other states or regulated markets that will either not allow that, or they will allow it through a sleeving process where you actually sleeve it back into the grid and you pay through the utility. So what you're finding is in deregulated markets, you're going to find that accelerating, stuff like Texas. In regulated markets, it will occur depending on the utility and the willingness to let others sleeve in.
Right. That makes sense. So a lot of different regulations across the U.S., different patchworks of what you can and can't do there.
There are.
That makes sense. David, question for you here. As you're looking at different sites and evaluating them, what are the elements that you look for beyond power and fiber proximity? Some of the maybe the non-obvious disqualifiers that you've learned to spot earlier and avoid some potential traps that could be costly down the road.
Yeah. So again, power is primary, and if we find a compelling power story, then we'll really try to make that work. But assuming all else being equal, I think we want to go places where the community wants us to be. So the community has demonstrated support for seeking out data centers, and in terms of like zoning and other community support. Like Jay said, beyond just traditional power, you might think like a 230 kV line or something like that. There's the segueing from what Jay said about behind the meter, it would be like proximity to gas infrastructure to kind of power that islanded or to fuel that islanded power solution. And then things like topo and just buildability. So at that point, it just becomes a regular like real estate development project. Is the land suitable for that purpose? And wetlands permitting and stuff like that.
Jay, we were also talking about this a little couple weeks ago, actually, which was kind of the perception around data centers, and unfortunately getting a little bit of a negative perception in some areas around water consumption, power consumption. Can you talk a little more about that and maybe break down some of those perceptions that are being seen out there?
Yeah, I mean, and some of it, look, if you go back a few years, there's some truth. In other words, you'll hear a lot of times that, gosh, data centers will use a ton of water. Well, it depends on the cooling system. And so in kind of, you have two kind of major, in a high category viewpoint, two major kind of areas of cooling. One's just called evaporative cooling, where you're using a lot of, almost like an old swamp cooler, where you're using water going through a filter and a fan going through that, and you're evaporating so that the water is actually absorbing the heat and producing some colder air. From an effective, or I guess efficiency standpoint, the most effective way to cool just uses a ton of water. Another one is both then a closed loop, where you have some water into a closed loop. It recycles through, usually will last anywhere 3 to 4 years. And then a way to cool that water again once it goes through the loop. That can be either water chilled or air chilled. And so what you're finding is more and more hyperscalers, neoclouds are going to a closed loop, air chilled system, which just doesn't use a whole lot of water. So the argument now that, hey, this is going to use all the water really isn't an argument anymore. The other one, it will be sound. So a lot of times you'll hear sound is a big issue, certainly in some parts of the country. The problem with that is, the data centers were built and the sound usually, and think about this, is almost like your air conditioning system outside your house. If you have central air, when you're in the summer, it's going, you can hear it.
Scale that up to a data center size, it's a lot
loud.
more.
It can be, and certainly the problem is the buildings are built to scale and with a certain amount of weight on a roof, and all of a sudden that building is there, and now homes come in maybe 5 years later in a close proximity, and they're going to complain about the noise. The problem is they can't mitigate it now, or their ability to mitigate it is lessened just because the ability to put weight on top of the building is limited because of the structure. Given that now, again, I mean, what they've done is from a sound perspective, there's ways to mitigate that typically you're you're below the ambient noise that's already out there. So sound really isn't a concern unless you hear so much. And so the other one is power usage. Right? Our rates will go up, and you're seeing utilities do different stuff where they create their own GenCos. And so whoever comes in, the large users are actually paying for all the infrastructure, everything from the generation to the lines, and doesn't impact rates at all. So a lot of false perceptions out there. And then the last one could just be aesthetics, right? And so the advantage, though, of the data center is it's usually high tax dollars for a region with very limited traffic. And so an advantage for a lot of communities in that perspective.
Okay, so that's a good point, and that'd be a reason why you'd want to invite a data center to your community. Being, say, an average person who's living there who's not employed by the data center, you might see some tax benefits, tax dollars flowing back in your community without having a bunch of semi trucks coming through like you might have a distribution or manufacturing site.
Absolutely. Ironically, there's a lot of communities that are dying to have data centers in there, and they recognize that. So large tax dollars you're having, it is a lot of folks where if you figure per data center, and again, data centers can range anything from 200,000 square feet to 800,000 square feet or larger, right? So just rough numbers, you're somewhere around 30 to 50 people on a 24-hour basis shift per data center. So, if you got 8 buildings out there, you're a couple hundred folks out there on maybe 3 to 4 different shifts. And so all those folks are making decent money. All the restaurants, all the stores, everything nearby will benefit as well.
Yeah, and that can be a big impact in a small town where they might have available land and available talent to be able to come in and manage these data centers. That's a really good boost to the economy in that way as well.
Absolutely.
And I would also add, those are good jobs and that's important, but they're also very stable jobs there because they're infrastructure jobs and they're supporting that infrastructure investment from these tech companies. They're a little bit disconnected from that standards like business cycle that you might see. It's a source of revenue from the community that's not going to see that like boom bust cycle. And that really helps investment in the community downstream.
That's a really good point too. And what type of a time horizon is usually envisioned as data centers are being built to be able to say, hey, we're going to have this up and operating in its current state with minor modifications for the next timeline? What does that typically look like?
It can be as short as from a building from being, hey, we have announced the project. And usually when it's announced, there's been a lot of work behind the scenes. So they've worked with the community's agreed. Assuming that no rezoning needs to occur, you can have a full building up and operational as short as 18 months. Again, if there's zoning that needs to occur, if there's a large land work where there's blasting, kind of a lot of topo work, it can take a couple of years.
And then once the data center is up and built, what does the lifetime of that facility look like? Is there a point when you say, all right, it's reached maximum lifetime, it's time to gut it, rebuild, or do a complete retrofit on it?
Great question. And because we used to laugh, some of the stuff that Amazon went into in 2006, we finally left, or Amazon finally left one a couple of years ago, but those buildings they'll stay in there for years. What will happen though, depending on the cooling system, Paul, and some other things, as chips can become more and more powerful and you need more and more cooling for that rack in there, then at some point you may outlive the cooling system of that data center, or you just need to put a lot less racks in there and it becomes less effective.
Yep. A maximum cooling capacity.
We had that question, like what happens to these buildings in 15 years? I used to tell communities in 15 years, you can use as the indoor football training for your local high school, or what. If folks leave, then there's really no environmental downside to that building there. So there's no chemicals or anything from that gets spilled or anything. And so you can go back and if it was farmland, you could refarm it again if you want to, or use that asset in another way.
Yeah, that's a really good point. No heavy metals, no chemical processing, nothing like that. It's just a completely clean site again.
Yep. With a big empty shell, it would be great for a football team.
Yeah, you put anything in there. Peter, back to you here for another question. On the power side here, data centers typically need a lot of constant uptime, while renewables tend to be pretty intermittent depending on the wind, on the sun, and kind of what those cycles are. How does AGP's renewable energy background play into your power strategy from a data center perspective?
Yeah, makes sense. So you're totally right. There's sort of mismatch there between the two uptimes. Data centers have to be up high uptime, whereas naturally renewables can't support that. But what we're seeing is that, and this has been happening in renewables before the data center boom, was the use of battery energy storage systems. And that's really to smooth out the generation profile of when the wind's blowing or when the sun's shining. And that was to meet the load profile of day-to-day use. When you turn on your washing machine at night, it's not necessarily that it perfectly lines up with when the sun's shining, for example. But with data centers, we're seeing high volatility in terms of when the training cycles are running and when the batches are being run through the data center. You have big swings in terms of full power utilization to 60 or 80% utilization. So that when we're talking about a data center that's hundreds of megawatts, that's a big swing and a big draw or impact to the grid. And the way you can mitigate the dramatic impact to the grid is you place a battery between, call it the load, the data center side, and the grid. So that's one way that a traditional renewable developer like AGP is able to, provide that solution for the data center side. And that relationship can come in either through the data center development side, or it can come in support of the grid for the utility. So that's sort of like one angle of how the two sides of the house really work together to provide a service to the grid or provide a service to the data center, and ultimately to allow more data centers to go on in one place on the system.
And what kind of battery technologies are you seeing there? In Switzerland, I see a lot of these dams that are pumping water back up over the wall when they've got a power excess, so they can just store it just through potential energy that way. Obviously, you've got traditional lead acid batteries, things like that, potentially lithium ion as well too. What are you seeing in the data center space for that energy storage?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. There's a lot of, historically, there's been a lot of different technologies on the data center or the power storage side. Pump storage being one of them. Obviously, that's constrained by location. Obviously, not everywhere has a dam or a hill that you can pump water up. And really, the main way it's done at an industrial scale and sort of location agnostic today is with lithium ion batteries. And these are container size batteries that you can ultimately site, I say pretty much anywhere on the grid, but Jay will correct me in terms of permitting locations and site considerations, but it's definitely more flexible than what you'd be seeing for pump storage or any of the other technologies.
Right. That makes sense. You can really be finite in your control of how much you're adding or drawing from that battery.
Not only are they location agnostic, but they're very technically sophisticated, and they can draw or charge and discharge very quickly. And that's important for data centers that are ramping up and down in fractions of a second. A little bit more difficult to do with physical technologies like pump storage.
Yep, that makes sense. And you've got moving mass that you need to wait to slow down, accelerate, decelerate, and move around that way. Jay, back to you here for a question on balancing speed against diligence. How do you make sure that AGP is moving in an agile and fast way within the market, but also not going too fast and avoiding any potential hidden issues? Where's that balance land, and kind of where do you draw that line?
Great question. And diligence becomes key, right? For a number of reasons of whether the soil, water table, other issues where if you are building, especially like a 2-story data center, that's a lot of weight, how far those piers need to go down. And if you misunderstand that can be a costly impact, as well as understanding the neighborhood, the community. If the community is not against it, or if the community is against it, or if they're not 100% for it, you can be surprised on how many folks will come out against something, which will again delay the project. So diligence is key. Meanwhile, sometimes you have a time that you need to move fast, and so often what we'll do is, if we know we need to go in an area, there'll be often more than one site that we're looking at simultaneously, and then we'll have a priority of that, and then it's red flag, then we can pivot fairly quickly.
So you've got backups and kind of layers that you can move to if you need to.
Absolutely.
That makes sense. Good to have a contingency plan in place.
At least one, if not several.
Yep. David, we've been talking a lot about data centers and AI from a provider angle. You and I have, talked a lot about AI and how you're using it. What are you seeing as ways that data center companies are using AI themselves?
Yeah, so AI is just like any other technology. It at its best, it helps you scale what you're already doing. So think about a spreadsheet, which everyone is really comfortable with spreadsheets, right? You could do all that stuff you do in a spreadsheet just like on a piece of scratch paper and with a calculator or whatever. But the spreadsheet allows you to scale that up and build things that were maybe strictly possible but impractical before, like a large complex financial model or something like that. Similarly, AI just helps you do what you're already doing, but at scale. So ways I'm using it now are just analyzing potential data center sites at scale. Could I do this like singly one by one? Yes, I can. But when I can do 50 at a time and process a larger pipeline, it helps me find better sites that, maybe just I'd be time bound. I wouldn't be able to find all the sites or analyze all the sites. When I was at Amazon, what did I use it for? I used it a lot for processing through large batches of emails. So, you're CC'd in a corporate environment, you're CC'd on a lot of emails. What are they saying? I don't know. Who knows what they're all saying? AI can help with that, right? So, hey, I want you to tell me everything that's going on with project XYZ. Okay, well, the due diligence is happening. Okay, tell me about that due diligence. Okay, well, here are the high risk items. Okay, tell me about the approval. It'll connect to the approval tool and tell you, okay, well, these 3 remaining teams have yet to approve the due diligence. Could I find out all that without AI? Yes, I could, but it's a lot of hunting and pecking, and having the AI just do that for you just really increases your ability to process a large body of things. Other ways, interesting ways to use it are kind of scale your technical ability rather than learning a new technical skill. Just, hey, write me a script that can do this. You're gonna have to say the write me a script part. I need to extract data from this PDF, and it will write up a Python script and extract data. Is there a world where you could learn how to do that? Yeah, you could watch a bunch of YouTube videos or whatever and figure out how to extract data from, a PDF, or you could just tell the AI, just, hey, do this thing for me. Now you have a data set made for you from a PDF that you can then go and use in your workflow. So again, just any technology, it's just helping you scale.
And that's pretty cool to see it come full circle around, and you're using the end tools and products that are out there. They're operating on the data centers that you're going out and helping to develop, and seeing where that all comes from. So really, really cool to see how you're using that too.
Yep, it's very cool. And every time I hit my usage limits, I just think we need another data center. I need
gotta find another site.
Yeah.
Jay, from site identification to energization, we talked a little about the typical timelines that you see. Where do these projects often get stuck? And when you're thinking about those contingency plans, when's that point when you say, "Yep, this one's just going to be a no-go. It's time to move on to option B or option C here"?
Typically, when you see a project that is underway, or someone looking to get something done in an area, and then for some reason that gets totally derailed, I'd say 90% it's a zoning issue. So whether they couldn't either annex into a city, or maybe the city planners and the city council or the county commissioners approved it, but as they got approved, there was so much pushback and lawsuits were brought in, and just gets delayed. And so you're finding that I'd say 90, maybe even 95%, it's almost all zoning issues where folks are going, we don't want this here. And unfortunately, some folks don't. Again, it's a lot of misinformation. Folks don't understand the full picture, and a lot of fear is driving some of that. And some of it's just unfounded fear. Outside of that, then, and usually the delays can be anywhere from what they call LLE, long lead equipment, where either information or equipment needs to come in, or power. So power can get delayed. So typically it's almost always zoning, but it could be your LOE wasn't planned for appropriately, or what we thought you're going to get a certain amount of power just doesn't come.
That makes a lot of sense. And that's that's a really good thing to be aware of as you're trying to accelerate and find new sites out there and develop those, is taking that into account earlier on and making sure
Yes.
that you can hopefully mitigate and reduce those potential risks there.
Absolutely.
Peter, what are we seeing going into 2026 here? What are the big trends that you're seeing across the data center market? What do you expect to happen here in the next year within this space?
I think there is going to be a lot of the same, a lot more announcements of developments. There's going to be an increasing purview that Northern Virginia isn't the end all be all, and we've already begun to see that. But as Jay alluded to, Texas, obviously there's large developments going on there. The deregulated markets, broadly speaking, are sort of seeing a resurgence in terms of new project announcements, and we expect that to continue. I think the big headline in terms of the AI, particularly in the US, is the potential IPO of OpenAI and Anthropic, and to a certain degree, SpaceX. And really the public market acceptance of those names, and ultimately once they are public businesses and have a credit rating, the direct relationship with those names could become increasingly common. So I think we'll see a list of new potential customers, and we'll see a broader purview of potential sites that you may not have expected, Jay, 6 years ago at Amazon. Some of the areas that we're looking at today may have not been in the worldview, in 2020, but in 2026, I think where the power is and where cost effective and timely power is going to really drive those conversations across all sorts of regions within the U.S.
Definitely. And Paul, I mean, I know you know, but I mean, obviously the first internet was kind of formed for the government with UCLA and I think in a few other schools, and they created that. And then, a number of other universities had their own kind of internal internet. And eventually with TCP, also you can be able to connect them all. And what you found was both from the first one in Northern Virginia, but also all the subsea cables going overseas, in both in Virginia and then kind of Northern California, and migrate a little bit up to Oregon and Washington. Those were the two major areas for compute. And that made sense. And then different cities had their old kind of phone systems or phone buildings, turning from old copper wires to glass fiber, and those become your kind of peering hotels. And so latency was always a huge issue with your typical kind of pre-AI cloud compute. Once you had AI, your LLMs can operate anywhere. And those are the ones that will have take up a lot of load. And as Peter said, those can literally exist anywhere. So what happened is,
So
Northern
it's really
Virginia,
opening up the market.
completely. Yes.
Wow. Well, hey, it sounds like we've got an exciting year coming up in this space. Thank you all for coming on the call today. That was Peter, Jay, and David from AGP. Thanks for being on.
Thanks, Paul.
Well, thank you.
Connect with Paul at KoetkeConsulting.com or on LinkedIn. More episodes on the way. Reach out if you're ready to scale.